diretora do Centro Educacional de São Sebastião, aqui no Distrito Federal. Então, começamos pelo vídeo Psicologia Social, Motivos que levam à violência.
This program is about understanding violence. Violence comes in many forms. It may involve acts of individual aggression, man against man, impulsive or carefully premeditated. It can be man against woman, or even among children. It may involve a fight or a passive victim. Most damages and deaths come from the violence of war, from soldiers who kill or maim each other, or inflict death and injury on helpless civilians. Sometimes violence may seem necessary to survive or to defend one's community. Violence, too, may bring its own rewards, power over others, a sense of triumph, pride, or status. Far more often, the fruits of violence are horrific and bring pain, suffering, and devastation. And yet it persists, as it has throughout human history and in most cultures. Why? We're going to limit our definition of violence to the deliberate inflicting of harm by one person or group on others. But even if we do this, we're still dealing with a highly complex phenomenon. Violence includes behaviors of many kinds and takes place in different contexts. To understand it, we have to call on a variety of explanations.
I think the way in which we understand aggression, the way in which we explain it to ourselves and know what we think at least is going on in aggressive episodes, comes from culture. It's culture that really allows us to imbue acts and interactions with significance, to know how to read them, what they mean, what they imply about us.
It certainly seems to be the case that there is a biological basis to violence. We know this from a wide variety of different studies which look at different biological processes.
Violence is not, it seems to me, an irrational eruption of instinct. It's not something that's undertaken blindly under orders. By and large, a person who engages in violence has to give himself, at the end of the day, or herself, reasons to do it. And that's why it's so important to look at what might be called the phenomenology of this. What the act of violence looks like from the perspective of the person about to do it.
To understand violence, then, we have to see it from several perspectives, in terms of culture, history, personal development, evolution, and individual biology. We need to consider a lot of issues like, in what ways might aggression have been useful to the evolution of our species? Do extreme forms of violence have their roots in biological processes or dysfunction of some kind? And in what ways does society influence our way of looking at things? Through our common history, for example, or through films, newspapers, and television. And what about influences in childhood? Do some children learn to be violent? And what effects do role models or rejection have? Whether or not a person will attack another depends also on how they interpret the situation they're in, on their beliefs and attitudes about how they should behave. And in part at least, violence is an act of choice. Well, in a half-hour program, we can only hope to get fragments of this complex picture. But let's look more closely to see what insights into violence we can find. Dr. Anne Campbell has spent most of her working life studying aggression. She believes that the origins of violence lie in the complex interactions between culture and biology.
We think that probably back in evolution at the time that our species was developing, males were relatively polygynous. That is, that they would fight amongst themselves for access to females. This meant that status and position and dominance in the male group was very, very important. The males who had the most resources were the mates that females wanted, and the males who had the most resources were usually the most dominant and often the most aggressive. If, in fact, females selected males on the basis of their dominance, then we should expect that those genes would have stayed in the gene pool.
This pattern of the use of aggression by males for achieving dominance and status shows itself early on. While aggressive acts may occur in both boys and girls, and much of it may be learned, Dr. Campbell sees conflict in boys taking a particular form.
So among boys, aggression starts to take on a much stronger social significance about their standing in the group. And usually by about 5 or 6, boys have developed dominance hierarchies. That is, they've established for themselves the relative pecking order, as it were, within the group. Among 6 or 7-year-old boys, physical agility, physical competence is very important in terms of the boy's position in the dominance hierarchy. Boys respect other boys who are good at rough and tumble, who are good at sports, who can use their body persuasively to control and coerce other boys. But with age, things do begin to change. But yet by 17, the ways of establishing status in the group may have altered. In some groups, it may be that, for example, being verbally clever, being able to tell great stories, may be more important. It may be in other groups that owning Reeboks or getting to drive your dad's BMW is the determining factor of status. But for many groups who don't have access to those sort of channels, physical ability, the ability to handle oneself in a fight, the refusal to be intimidated or to be insulted by anyone may still be an important aspect of how you maintain dominance in the group.
Silly boy, I didn't want to have to do this. But we're going to have to.
Typically what men do in groups is that they do things. They go to football matches, they go to the pub. Much of their kind of orientation is towards some sort of activity that they do together, and often these activities are competitive. So that even within groups that are friendship groups, there is still a striving for relative status within that group. So even within groups of, for example, soccer fans, you can see that there is rivalry going on as to who is going to assume certain positions of leadership, who is going to be the nutter in this group, who is going to take on the other guys against amazing odds, and so on. And so, in a sense, intergroup hostility, as you see with football fans, is often a means of elevating your own status within your own friendship group. By being the leader that can vanquish some opposing group, you gain much more status among your own peers. I think men's involvement in physical sports that involve contacts of some kind probably stems out of men's general interest both in rough and tumble and physical activity, and with the use of that as a means of establishing status and dominance. The two come together beautifully in sport, and furthermore are rule governed, so that within the constraints of the game there are only certain ways in which you may tackle, certain ways in which you may win. So in a sense, sport offers men a particular arena in which they can play out their real interests in physicality, in dominance, in aggression, but in a relatively safe form.
Anne Campbell's co-evolution approach emphasizes the close intertwining of culture and biological predispositions. Our patriarchal culture glamorizes the cold efficiency of instrumental violence. Our heroes are so often those who save others through their bravery, fists and weapons. Violence is a way of getting good or necessary things done, for achieving status. Young men grow up among these heroic images of violence on film and television screens. But although our culture may glorify violence, this usually takes ritualized expression, as in popular films and in sport. Relatively few individuals themselves kill and damage others. How do we explain those that do? Professor Adrian Raine believes that biological processes may have something to do with it.
There are some studies which show that violent offenders have lower levels of serotonin. That's a brain neurotransmitter which is involved in communication in the brain. We also suspect that violent offenders have higher testosterone levels. That's a male hormone. We have also conducted a study recently which shows that violent offenders have dysfunction to the prefrontal region of the brain. This is a study in which we took 41 convicted murderers and matched them to 41 comparison normal controls. These are people who have committed no violent offences. They are each individually matched with a murderer on age and sex. They then all underwent PET, or positron emission tomography. That's a brain imaging technique which allows us to assess glucose metabolism in different regions of the brain. The significance of that is that cells use glucose, if you like, as their fuel. The greater the glucose metabolism, the greater the brain functioning. So by measuring glucose metabolism, we can assess brain functioning. Basically what we found is that the murderers had reduced glucose metabolism specifically in the prefrontal region of the brain. At the top of the scan, that's the prefrontal cortex. That's in red and yellow, indicating high glucose metabolism, high prefrontal functioning. The prefrontal cortex is involved in regulating and controlling social behavior. If you have dysfunction to that part of the brain, you'll become much more impulsive. Certainly in our study, many of our murderers were impulsive one-off murders where they might have met a stranger in the street, they got into an argument, and they committed homicide.
Me and Roger were cycling out to Sandwich that day, and just back there by the roundabout, somebody came past in a car, shouting and giving his horn.
And he was driving very close, so I just sort of waved him away to give us more room. And then as he passed, he just jammed his brakes on hard, slid to a halt in the road, and immediately reversed back at myself. Well, I did a quick U-turn in the road, so I was going the other way, and rode away. As he chased me down, he was driving down the road backwards, trying to run me down. I was cycling away from him.
I tried to drive round him on the outside. He went forward again, put on his brakes again, until he eventually shunted me across the road on the other side of the road, where on the curb, I stumbled off my bike, and he jumped out of his car and just laid into me with his fists until I was bloodied and on the ground. Then he kicked me in the face several times. And I felt at that point that he was going to kill me.
However, we did have another type of murderer in our study. We had just a few individuals who were multiple murderers. For example, we had one murderer who committed over 50 murders in a 12-year period. That type of murder, obviously, that type of violence is very different. It's very controlled. The person has to plan ahead. They have to be rather clever and sophisticated to escape police detection for over 12 years. This individual had a very different brain profile. They actually had extensive activation of the prefrontal cortex, which actually fits our notion that the prefrontal cortex is involved in carefully regulating and controlling social behavior.
Rain links the prefrontal cortex not only with the control of impulsive behavior, but with arousal level. This is a complex measure based on resting heart rate, skin conductivity, or sweating, and the electrical activity of the brain. In one study, Rain tested the arousal levels of a large group of schoolboys. When he followed them up years later, he found that the ones who become involved in violent crime were the ones who had had significantly lower arousal levels than the others. But why? He thinks lower arousal could be associated with lowered anxiety levels.
For example, we know that bomb disposal experts have very low resting heart rates. Furthermore, if you take bomb disposal experts who have been decorated for their bravery and who are particularly fearless, we presume, they have especially lower resting heart rates than the other bomb disposal experts.
Alistair has passed out top and has been posted to his own country, Scotland, in charge of bomb disposal operations. He and his wife, Carol, have got what they most wanted.
A lot of the excitement has gone out of the army, and this is one area where they can go out and get a certain amount of excitement and enjoyment.
So we think that low arousal is a marker for a lack of fear. If you lack fear, then you're not bothered about getting involved in a fight because you're not frightened about anyone doing injury to yourself. The second explanation of under-arousal predisposing to crime is stimulation seeking. The idea here is that if you have very low levels of arousal, you seek out stimulation to increase your arousal levels back to normal. The intriguing question for me is, what is the environmental context which on the one hand transforms under arousal in a child into a criminal, violent way of life, and yet on the other hand can transform a child into a very law-abiding citizen who may even save lives rather than take life? We really at the present time have no idea about what the answer is, but I'm convinced that it's the social context which interacts with the biological factor under arousal in predisposing to later crime.
Many studies from the classics of Harlow and Bowlby have shown how young animals and children deprived of a continuous caring relationship may fail to develop emotional connections with others. Rain sees a complex interaction between such social factors and biological processes.
We often assume that a biological factor has to be genetically mediated, but that's not true. For example, the environment can cause the biological predisposition. Here's a specific example. Wadsworth did a study which showed that if you came from a family which was broken by divorce in the first 4 years of life, you are much more likely to be physiologically under-aroused at age 11. That shows, therefore, that perhaps experiencing early stress in life can change autonomic nervous system functioning. So it's interesting to remember that the social context and social experiential factors can change biological functioning and produce the biological predispositions that we then find go to create, or at least to predispose, to violent behavior much later on in life. Critically important point to make is that it's not just biology, it's not just environment, it's when both come together, it's the interplay and intermix between them which really is the important factor in understanding violent behavior.
Although individual differences are important, it's striking that all our illustrations of violence have featured men. This fits the fact that 10 times as many men as women are convicted of crimes of violence. Anne Campbell sees the origin of this gender difference in our evolutionary history. She also makes the point that men and women think about violence differently.
For most men, aggression is about taking control. It's about imposing control on a situation. And successfully imposing control on a situation often has big payoffs in terms of self-esteem and the way in which you're regarded by the community. So although men may not applaud aggression necessarily, they recognise it as a legitimate way in which order and control can be brought to bear on a situation that looks chaotic and frightening. I think women see aggression in a different sort of way. When women talk about their own aggression, they describe it in terms of losing self-control. So it's about control, but in a very different way. When women do become violent, it's often perceived by them to be involved with issues of uncontrollable anger or very high degrees of stress.
Oh, no, I've got a headache.
What we know about domestic violence suggests that it is often around issues of male control of the woman. One thing that triggers episodes is the man's suspicion of infidelity, whether he's right or he's not right. Another thing that seems to trigger male violence can be when the woman asserts her right to be independent of him. Perhaps she wants to get a job, perhaps she wants to go to university, perhaps she wants to move somewhere else. Attempts by the woman to, as it were, challenge his control, as he sees it, seem to be particularly powerful in provoking aggression in males.
Interestingly, Adrian Raine attempts to explain the gender difference in violence, partly in biological terms.
Is there something about maleness, per se, which predisposes an individual to violence? One of the studies that we conducted showed that low heart rate levels predisposed to later crime. What's interesting is that there's also a gender difference in resting heart rate. In normal males and normal females, males as a group have lower resting heart rate. So perhaps that's one clue to trying to understand gender differences in crime. Another measure is testosterone. Testosterone is a male hormone. It's much higher, obviously, in males than females. And even within males, there are studies which do appear to show that males with relatively high levels of testosterone are more likely to commit violence than males with lower levels of testosterone.
But not all studies have shown a link between testosterone and violence, and Anne Campbell sounds a warning note. As Raine himself recognises, biosocial interactions can work both ways.
The problem has been to try to decide which way round the causal relationship goes. We don't know if testosterone is pushing aggression or if aggression is pushing testosterone. But we do know that in a recent study by James Dabbs, he measured testosterone levels in football fans just before the World Cup final. He measured testosterone in Italian fans and in Brazilian fans, and before the match they were equal. At the end of the match, when Brazil had won, testosterone levels had increased by 25% in the Brazilian spectators and decreased by about the same amount in Italian spectators. So we know that simply witnessing conflict of that kind and losing or winning can have an effect on testosterone.
So we've seen how the origins of individual aggression lie in complex biosocial interactions. But how far do such explanations of individual violence help us to make sense of the group violence of war? War is by far the greatest source of violence among humankind. Michael Ignatieff has been to many countries, like the former Yugoslavia, where factional violence has broken out. He sees fear as an important factor.
People engage in violence as a kind of preemptive act of protection. Let's get our retaliation in first. They threaten us. If we strike first, they'll no longer threaten us. Fear, I think, drives violence because violence is seen as a solution to the problem of fear. In the case of former Yugoslavia, it's obvious that the collapse of the Tito state left many people in a state of fear. They ran to the protection of their ethnic group. That seemed to them to be the only way to guarantee their personal safety. That then committed them, for the sake of their own safety, to a project of ethnic expansion. What's interesting about group violence is people have to have reasons to commit it. Where do they look for their reasons? They customarily look to the ethnic traditions of the societies they come from and the way those ethnic traditions construe or define the groups that they're in competition with. And so they draw a tremendous amount of the ideological justification from violence from tribal or ethnic memory of previous stages of violence. And I think what you find in places like Northern Ireland, in former Yugoslavia, is that there's a well of historical memory of violence in the past. Violence between Protestants and Catholics, violence between Croats and Serbs, sometimes going back centuries. Transmuted into myth, fictionalized, turned around, but still based around a kernel of historical truth.
But even with reasons and history, violence still has to be justified.
What seems distinctive about human violence as opposed to the violence of animals or other species is that it seems morally problematic for us to commit violence against fellow creatures. And in order to commit violence, I think we have to depersonalize them. We have to dehumanize them. We have to break the human connection that exists between us and a member of our own species.
Today is the 24th of April, 1945. My name is Gunnar Illingworth and I live at Cheshire. I was present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS men. The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here.
We make them more threatening than we are. We exaggerate the rather minor differences that distinguish them from us. And we turn them into this kind of depersonalized, inhuman other that can be the safe receptacle of our violence, that deserves our violence because it is inhuman, inferior, and degraded.
The depersonalization of an enemy may help to explain how people can commit acts of violence in war. But what about individual differences here? How do we explain the horrors, for example, often meted out by groups of paramilitaries? Anne Campbell sees age as a significant factor.
One feature of paramilitary groups is that the men who are involved are often relatively young. In fact, they correspond to that same sort of age group who, in other populations, would be relatively high in crimes of violence. 17 to 28, that kind of age range seems to be a point in men's lives where they are particularly prone to very risky behaviour. It's a period in which men strive very much to assert themselves, to be somebody, to gain status. And I think in the context of intergroup hostility, that striving for status can become very frightening indeed. Because now, it's not simply a question of the man's position within the group, but the dominance of that group over another group. And I think when that is backed up with ideological rhetoric, that makes it justifiable in some way to eliminate, to kill and to brutally kill another group, and to have a cultural rhetoric that will make this okay. It's a very lethal combination of circumstances.
While he adds a psychodynamic twist, Michael Ignatieff agrees.
Someone like Sigmund Freud looked at these paramilitaries. He might say something like this, that in normal states, the state exercises a monopoly of the means of violence. When those states disintegrate, as is the case in ethnic conflict around the world, the state loses that monopoly and the violence, as it were, trickles down through the social body. And who picks up the violence that's left free? It's the young 18 to 25-year-old paramilitary. They're the people who suddenly discover that power is flowing from the barrels of their guns. It's a tremendously empowering thing. From a psychodynamic point of view, it releases a tremendous amount of their own libidinal energy and aggression. But the key thing is that libidinal energy and aggression is legitimated, is given permission to be expressed by the nationalist ideology that they're serving.
But how far can war be explained in terms of the dynamics of individual or even group aggression? Taking part in war may be more a matter of obedience than aggression. It may be a matter of playing out the role one's been assigned. It may be a matter of refusing to take responsibility or diffusing it onto others, especially those in command. Also, when groups or nations face conflict, it's then that they may feel strong and united.
We tend to think of violence as a tremendously negative thing, but violence can also have an enormously positive role in enhancing a nation or a community's sense of its own self-image and purpose. If you think back to the Falkland Islands and the invasion, here was a country, Britain, with very, very negative self-image, suddenly comes under a violent threat and finds itself in the grips of an enormous sense of national purpose, cohesion, commitment, patriotism. Every individual felt themselves soldered into a national project.
So we've seen the complexity of the factors underlying both individual and group violence. To understand them, we've argued, you need to take into account not only human evolution and biology, but culture, childhood influences, and the nature of group dynamics. Can taking such a multiple perspective approach help us to change the way things are? Perhaps not. But Michael Ignatieff finds room for hope in the human capacity for reason